Good day. Today is Monday, 10th March 2025, and like I have done with my previous two programs, I'm going to start this program with a discussion of the military situation, specifically in Kursk region, in the wider conflict between Russia and Ukraine, because the events that are playing out there are extraordinarily dramatic, and we're now starting to get clarity as to exactly what has been happening. And I'm going to anticipate by saying that the worst accounts about the state of the fighting in Kursk region, the worst accounts from a Ukrainian point of view, are turning out to be true. There has never, in my opinion, been a collapse as sudden and as complete and as catastrophic as this for the Ukrainians on any part of the battlefronts at any point since the start of the conflict in February 2022. Now, I say that with some care. Obviously, none of the places that are being fought over are big towns and places like Mariupol, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Toretsk, Krasnogorovka, Sverdlikovo, Kurachovo, or places of that scale. The biggest place that the Ukrainians captured in Kursk region is the small town of Sudzha. And as I said, Sudzha is not, in terms of scale, comparable to these other places. However, the number of Ukrainian troops who are being caught up in this catastrophe seems to be comparable to the number that we saw in those other battles. They seem to include some of the best units of the Ukrainian army, airborne paratroop units, for example. And, well, to say it simply, I have never seen at any point in the special military operation, the course of the special military operation, quite such a chaotic picture of comprehensive collapse as appears to have, has unfolded in Kursk region over the last 48 or longer hours. Mostly when a collapse comes, when a defeat comes, when the Ukrainians lose their positions in places like Bakhmut or Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, or some place like that, they have been able up to now to establish a front line somewhere behind their original positions. That front line often has not held for very long, but for the moment in Kursk region we are seeing nothing like that. And to be straightforward about it, I don't think we will. I think that the situation points to a collapse completely of Ukrainian resistance in Kursk region. Most likely what we're going to see is some kind of an attempt of a disorganized retreat of Ukrainian troops from Kursk region back into Ukraine, with a high probability that most of them will not be able to escape, and with an even higher probability that the Russians will follow closely on their tail and will enter Sumy region behind them. Moreover, we are seeing lots of pictures now, photographs and films of Ukrainian soldiers, again, it's important to say from elite brigades, giving up the battle and surrendering to the Russians. I don't think I've seen quite so many pictures, quite so many photographs of Ukrainian soldiers being taken prisoner as I have seen over the last 24 hours coming out of Kursk region at any point since the start of the special military operation. And not only this, but there's also been lots of other pictures of retreating Ukrainian convoys being attacked by Russian drones and Russian artillery, with terrible effects on the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers who are trying to retreat. And there's been also pictures of Ukrainian soldiers trudging across the roads with the drones buzzing above them, trying to escape basically towards Suja, which, so far as I can see, is only the penultimate stop before the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region flee into Ukraine itself. Now, in this program, I'm going to discuss, or at least try to put together, what we've seen happen over the last, shall we say, 48 to 96 hours. I want to make it very clear that I'm not going to discuss the tactics in a huge amount of detail, because for the moment, I don't know all the story about the tactics. There's been some descriptions. To give one example, the famous attack that took place through the gas pipeline appears to have been on a much bigger scale than I had initially appreciated. I imagined a small group of special forces soldiers going through the pipeline, trudging through the 12 kilometers of the pipeline and coming out in the rear of the Ukrainians. And according to most accounts that I saw early on, about 100 soldiers were involved. It looks like the force was much bigger than this, that it numbered several hundred at least. But anyway, I will discuss that later in this program. I think the first point to start, a good point to start, is to understand where the Ukrainians were defending just a few days ago. Firstly, already by the beginning of February, the Russians had reduced the size of the territory that the Ukrainians controlled in Kursk region to around a third of its peak size at the end of August 2024. So the Russians had been steadily whittling down the Kursk salient, if I can put it like that, so that it had shrunk significantly during that point of time and had become basically an area located around the town of Suja. But the Ukrainians did have a series of defenses that they'd established around Suja. There was Svedlikovo to the west. There were the villages of Pogrebki and Malaya Loknia to the north. There was Cherkasskaya Porechnoye and Ruskaya Porechnoye to the northeast. There was Martinovka, also somewhat to the northeast, on the main road to Kursk region. And, well, the Russians had been making progress, and they, some time before, apparently captured the village of Cherkasskaya Konopelka, immediately to the east of Suja. But anyway, there was a sort of broad perimeter that the Ukrainians, villages that the Ukrainians had established around Suja. And not just Suja, but along the along protecting the main supply road from Suja to Sumy region, the road along which the Ukrainians sent men and supplies and machines to keep the force in Suja and in Kursk region supplied. Well, a couple of weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, the Russians gradually began their offensive. Pogrebki quickly fell. After Pogrebki, other places started to come under pressure, and the Russians also captured Svedlikovo to the west of Suja, bringing them much closer to the main road, and they'd already been making progress for some time south and east of Suja as well. Well, about 5 days ago, as I've discussed in my main program, after Svedlikovo fell, after the Russians advanced south of Suja as well towards the main road, the Russians were able to establish fire control over the main supply road, and by the way also over the various other small roads, the country roads, the dirt tracks in effect, that also lead into Suja. And that began the Ukrainian crisis in Suja itself. However, it's important to say that this cutting off of the supply lines only really happened last week, and it cannot by itself be a sufficient explanation for this sudden collapse, the collapse that we're now going to discuss, because presumably the Ukrainians will have stockpiled supplies in Suja and various other places, and logically it should take some days or weeks of fighting before those supplies started to run down to the point where it became difficult or impossible for the Ukrainians to keep on fighting. Well, anyway, shortly after the supply lines started to get cut, the village, as I said, of Pogrebki had already fallen, and then on Saturday we learned that the village, the important village of Novaya Sorochina, south of Pogrebki and north of Malaya Lokhnia, had fallen. And then on Saturday we also learned that Cherkasskoye Porechnoye had also fallen, and then the wave struck, and it appears to have struck yesterday. And well, we've got information about this from the Russian Defense Ministry and Group of Forces North, but briefly they say that during offensive actions, Group of Forces North liberated the settlements of Kozitska, Malaya Lokhnia and Cherkasskoye Porechnoye. All of these villages over the course of Saturday and Sunday have fallen under Russian control. And in fact, we now have photographs which conclusively confirm that Cherkasskoye Porechnoye and Malaya Lokhnia are under Russian control. And also Lebyedivka, another village somewhat to the southwest of Malaya Lokhnia, is also under Russian control. But we've now had more pictures, more photos, which confirm that other places are under Russian control also. These include the village of Martinovka, northeast of Suja, on the main road from Suja to Kursk, a bitterly fought over village, by the way, in August, when the Ukrainians began their offensive in Kursk. Anyway, it is now firmly under Russian control. Various other villages and settlements, much smaller places, are under Russian control as well. Some have counted and said that 7 important villages formerly under Ukrainian control, each and every one of them making part or forming a part of the defense line around Suja, have fallen under Russian control over the space of 48 hours. Places like Malaya Lokhnia, Cherkasskoye Porechnoye, Lebyedivka, Martinovka, places like that. And that doesn't capture the quality of this collapse, because I've been watching drone film from this area, and it is quite extraordinary. I have never seen anything quite like it. I've not at any point during this conflict since February 2022. I've seen pictures of convoys of Ukrainian troops on wheeled vehicles trying to flee their positions in the north, being cut to pieces and destroyed by Russian artillery and drones. And by the way, it seems that Russian helicopter gunships, the dreaded Kamov 52s, are also busy flying over Kursk region at the moment, attacking the fleeing Ukrainian soldiers. And I've also seen pictures of Ukrainian troops fleeing by foot, trying to escape. There's a haunting film showing a large column of Ukrainian troops on foot. Well, from what I can tell, running along the main road through the village of Kazachya Lotnya, just north of Suja. They seem to be fleeing in a completely disorganized way towards Suja itself. This group of soldiers, obviously they're being filmed by the Russians, by the Russian drones. They haven't yet been attacked in these films. I suspect they were later after the film ended. And I've seen pictures and photographs of Ukrainian soldiers surrendering to the Russians in numbers that I have never seen before. Soldiers in various locations, apparently all sorts of units have been cut off from each other as a result of this lightning Russian advance, as a result of the collapse of the Ukrainian defense lines. In some places, some of these soldiers apparently try to fight. In a few places, they mount counterattacks. Apparently, Ukrainian communications have completely broken down, and it's claimed by some reporting channels that when these counterattacks take place, it's mostly because the Ukrainian soldiers who are conducting them have not appreciated the extent to which the front lines around them have collapsed, and, well, they're still fighting in the belief or expectation that there are other units on their flanks that will defend them. Anyway, lots of that going on, but also lots and lots of surrenders, lots of Ukrainian troops cut off in small groups, uncertain presumably what to do, where to flee towards. Some of them in forests and fields, hunted down by the Russians, by the drones and that kind of thing. And overall, the general impression is that this chaotic retreat, to the extent that there's any method behind it, is converging on Suja itself. That even places like Kazachya Lotnya, just north of Suja, are likely to be abandoned by the Ukrainians effectively without a fight at some point within the next day or couple of days, or perhaps even hours. So a chaotic rout as the Ukrainians flee towards Suja. And coming back to the story of the pipe, well, according to the Russians, this was a complex operation planned by the Russians about 3 weeks ago, presumably as they sensed that this collapse of the Ukrainian troops in Kursk was underway. As I said, about 300 special forces troops from various Russian special forces units came together to carry out the attack. We are undoubtedly talking about one of the main gas pipelines used previously by the Russians to transfer gas through Suja to Ukraine, and then from Ukraine to Europe. The Russians pumped out the gas that was still in the pipeline. They then pumped oxygen to replace it. They made the pipeline suitable for use by troops, and this unit of around 300 Special Forces troops, under the overall command of Major General Alaudinov, the commander of the Akhmat Special Forces unit. He is himself a Chechen, and a lot of the troops in the Akhmat Special Forces unit are ethnic Chechens. But in a recent program we did with him, the reporter Patrick Lancaster explained that the Akhmat Special Forces unit consists of many troops of different ethnicities from across Russia. Perhaps there's even a majority of ethnic Russians amongst them. It's not by any means an exclusively ethnic Chechen group, as I had previously assumed it to be. Anyway, this Special Forces unit played a critical role in this operation, and Alaudinov appears to have been the officer who originally supervised this operation. There is film of him giving an inspirational speech. You could call it an inspirational speech. Anyway, a talk to the soldiers before they mounted this operation. But the Akhmat Special Forces were not the only Special Forces group involved in this operation. I'm not going to go into the details of it myself. Anyway, they went through the pipeline. They walked 12 kilometers through the pipeline, which seems an extraordinary feat, physical feat in and of itself. I mean, as somebody who has done quite a lot of walking in my life, I would say that a 12-kilometer walk of any kind is, well, it's not perhaps an enormous challenge, but you certainly are aware of the fact that you've walked a distance. Trying to walk through a pipe of this kind, even a large pipe, well, I'm not going to try to even imagine or try to describe what it's like. And to do it for 12 kilometers, that seems to me astonishing. Anyway, they did it. They got through, and they appear to have entered the industrial suburb of Mirny, industrial suburb of Suja. And most reports suggest that Mirny is now completely under Russian control. And it could very well be that it was the presence of these Russian troops in Mirny which panicked the Ukrainian troops who were defending Martinovka and caused them to pull out from Martinovka and to flee down the road, the main road through Mirny to Suja, and to abandon Martinovka to the Russians. Now, to repeat, we have photographs which confirm the presence of the Russians in Malaya Lochnia. There's extraordinary pictures of a Russian soldier waving the Russian flag from some kind of tall structure, apparently in the center of Malaya Lochnia. He doesn't look to be in any danger, the particular soldier. Clearly, Malaya Lochnia, bitterly fought over village, the place that had in some ways been the linchpin of Ukrainian defences north of Suja. That has clearly fallen. There's also pictures of a large group of Russian soldiers waving flags on top of the building of the women's prison close to Malaya Lochnia. This is one of the strongest points in Malaya Lochnia. And from what I can tell, it appears to have fallen to the Russians with barely any fighting. There is film of the Russians in Cherkasskoye Porechnoye that appeared on Saturday. And just before I made this program, there is also film of the Russian soldiers in Martinovka as well. It looks as if Martinovka is firmly under Russian control. There is no film that I've seen of the Russians in Mirny, but I have no doubt, as of the time of making this program, that they are indeed there. And as I said, the column of Ukrainian troops who were fleeing Kazachia, Lochnia, that suggests to me that that village, critically important, literally on the northern boundary of Suja itself, is about to pass under Russian control as well, probably without a fight, because the Ukrainians are abandoning it. So, presumably, by late evening today, or perhaps tomorrow, the only territory, the only place left in Kursk region which will be under some kind of Ukrainian control will be Suja itself. There will be lots of Ukrainian troops still scattered across the countryside in small groups, being hunted down and rounded up or killed by the Russians. A grim and horrible story. But if one is talking about units that retain some level of organization, they will be located inside Suja itself. Everywhere else, the entire countryside in Kursk region is now almost completely within Russian control and will fall under Russian control very shortly. Now, those troops in Suja, it's completely unclear to me who is commanding them. I don't know what the name of the Ukrainian commander in Suja is, or by the way, if there even is one. And I don't know what kind of instructions these Ukrainian troops are getting. There are lots of rumors that over the next couple of hours, they're going to try to retreat into Ukraine itself to escape. The Russians have fire control over the roads. Troops that try to escape from Suja will meet a terrible fate in the great majority of cases. They can, of course, choose to hold firm and try to organize some kind of a defense. But Suja is a small place. It's scattered. As I said, there's lots of buildings, often at some distance from each other. It's perhaps not the easiest place to defend, actually. You don't have a single coherent place that you can defend in the way that you found in, say, Chasov Yar or places like that. But anyway, there might be some attempts to defend Suja, given the fact that the supply routes into Suja are cut, the relatively small territory of the town, the lack of buildings there, the lack of industrial buildings there. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that if there is a defense, it won't last very long. Probably a lot of the soldiers will surrender, and, well, those that remain will either be killed, or if they're fortunate enough to be wounded, they'll fall into the hands of the Russians. So, again, it's not easy for me to give predictions, but when a collapse on this scale comes, it's difficult to avoid the impression that the presence of Ukrainian troops in Kursk region, in Russia, in other words, Kursk region is the only territory inside Russia that the Ukrainians have ever been able to hold at any time over the course of this war, that this presence is about to end. Obviously, it's going to take several hours. Perhaps it might take a couple of days, but we are now almost at the end. Patrick Lancaster, by the way, since I mentioned him, said to us on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and me, over the course of a recent program that we did with him, a program, not the very latest program, but the one just before. He said to us that he'd just been to Kursk. In fact, he gave us a very detailed description of the state of the fighting in Kursk. And he said that the soldiers had told him, the Russian soldiers in Kursk region, had told him that they expected Kursk region to be liberated from the Ukrainians in March. Well, we are in March, and we see that is exactly how things have turned out. Now, there are lots of unanswered questions as to why such a sudden collapse has happened. Now, Russian commentaries, Riyadh, for example, are quite clear that it is not because there is an overwhelming force of Russian troops in Kursk region. And we can put aside the question of the North Koreans, because not a scintilla of evidence has appeared that they are actually there, despite attempts by some Ukrainian channels like DS to pretend that they are. So we're not talking about an enormous Russian force that outnumbers the Ukrainians by multiples. So how did it happen? Well, one can draw some preliminary conclusions. Firstly, it's been obvious to me for some weeks that after the succession of disasters that the Ukrainian army experienced after the fall of Avdiivka, the Ukrainian leadership has been desperate to mount some kind of offensive in some places. So there was the Kursk offensive in August, but as I've discussed in many places, that didn't really achieve any of its objectives. Then over the last few weeks, since the November election, the Ukrainians have been keen to conduct counterattacks in some other place. They twice tried to launch counterattacks in Kursk region itself, one of them towards the village of Berdin. We discussed that extensively in various programs. That counterattack was a complete disaster, as was the subsequent counterattack that the Ukrainians also tried to launch in Kursk region as well. And according to Denis Pushilin, who is not always a completely reliable source, but who presumably does know a bit about the situation, he is, after all, the governor of the Donetsk People's Republic, the political leader of Donetsk region, that part of Donetsk region that considers itself Russian. Anyway, according to Denis Pushilin, after the failure of these Ukrainian counterattacks in Kursk region, the Ukrainian leadership, Zelensky and Syrsky, withdrew 2 brigades from Kursk region and the area that, around, and transferred them to Donbass, principally to the area around Pokrovsk. And it is the presence of these 2 brigades around Pokrovsk that has enabled the Ukrainians to mount their various counterattacks around Pokrovsk. The counterattacks that reports led the Ukrainians to claim that they had recaptured the village of Kotlino. By the way, Riyadh today denies that this is the case. It insists that Kotlino is still under Russian control. The Ukrainians also tried to attack Pishanye another village near Pokrovsk. They may have occupied parts of Pyshanye for a while, but ultimately the counterattacks failed and Pyshanye is back under Russian control. But now they're launching another counterattack towards the village of Shevchenko, which the Russians captured way back in the autumn. So far, none of these counterattacks appears to have been at all successful. And all of this has happened even as the Ukrainians have launched various raids. I think that they don't really amount to counterattacks in and around the town of Toretsk, which the Russians said that they had captured, fully captured, about 2 weeks ago. So it looks to me as if Zelensky and Syrskyi, in their anxiety to demonstrate to the Ukrainian people and perhaps to Zelensky's political opponents in Kiev, but also and mostly to Ukraine's Western allies, perhaps especially to the Trump administration, that Ukraine is still in the fight. Anyway, it seems to me that Zelensky and Syrskyi, after the failure of the counterattacks in Kursk, decided that they would try somewhere else. There weren't enough troops to try somewhere else, so they took the fatal decision to transfer to those other places, Pokrovsk and perhaps Toretsk, troops who had previously been in Kursk. And Pushilin says that they reassigned 2 brigades to Pokrovsk, and that perhaps significantly weakened the Ukrainian grouping in Kursk region, just ahead of what was clearly a long-planned Russian offensive in Kursk region. And that might have led to the collapse itself. But though that is an explanation, and though it takes us quite a long way towards understanding what happened, it is not a sufficient explanation. In order to understand why there has been a collapse on the scale that we have seen, something else must have happened. There must have been a collapse in morale and an abandonment of a willingness to fight on the part of the Ukrainian soldiers. Now, why would that be? Now, there are possible explanations. One possible explanation is that the Ukrainian soldiers on the ground have now become demoralized because of all of the reports of negotiations that are coming, that they sense that the United States is reducing its willingness to help Ukraine. That's made Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefronts feel that there's little point any longer in holding their positions in the way that they have done, and that partly explains what's happening. Again, I don't think that's a sufficient explanation, because if it were true, and there's no evidence, by the way, that it is true, it would still not explain the extent of the rout. I am going to suggest that the explanation is provided by information that's been provided by Group of Forces North for some time now, which is that according to Group of Forces North, the Ukrainian brigades who have been fighting in Kursk region have suffered very, very heavy losses for a very, very long time. They've been brought back up to strength by recently mobilized soldiers. Many of these soldiers are now very young. They lack the morale and motivation of the soldiers whose place they are taking. And quite plausibly, these soldiers who lack morale and who lack the training that their predecessors had when they faced the kind of pressure from the Russians that the forces in Kursk region have experienced over the last 96 hours. Their defense simply collapsed. And I think that is probably the single best explanation of all. Certainly, as I said in my program yesterday, it cannot have had anything to do with any denial of intelligence information from the United States. That would not have had sufficient time to take effect, and certainly it would not have had any connection to any denial of equipment by the United States. Again, that too would not have had the time to take effect. And by all accounts, by every account that I have read, the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region have been amongst the best equipped, the best supplied with equipment of any of the Ukrainian forces anywhere along the conflict line. So there it is. We will perhaps get a fuller account of the story. There have probably been major command errors as well. I get the sense that the generals in charge in Kursk perhaps weren't doing their job properly. They didn't consider the possibility that the Russians would send special forces through the pipeline, all that kind of thing. But one way or the other, perhaps the best explanation of all is the simplest one, that the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk region no longer have the heart for the battle as they did back in August. And that, by the way, may point to the future of what's going to happen across the front lines when the big Russian offensives start to unroll after the end of the spring thaw. Because all accounts confirm that the Russians are building up their forces, that they are still recruiting large numbers of troops. Apparently, Russian soldiers get at least 6 months training. Some of them get up to a year's training. It depends whether they've served in the military before. Russian factories are churning out weapons in ever larger quantities. There's been lots of reports about how military production in Russia continues to rise, and lots of reports also speak of the Russians sorting out their logistics, preparing further advances, drone-proofing the main roads. Pictures and film are appearing now in several places of the Russians establishing netting over roads to protect the troops and armored units that move along these roads from Ukrainian drones. Anyway, lots of things are taking place, and it looks as if the Russians most probably will begin an offensive, a big offensive, perhaps at the start of April. And if these morale issues that we see the Ukrainians experiencing in Kursk repeat themselves across the entire front line, well, we might start to see some very dramatic developments indeed. Now, just to say, it is not only in Kursk that things are taking place. The Russians yesterday confirmed that the village of Konstantinopol in the Andreevka fortified area has been captured. That appears to confirm that the entire Andreevka fortified area has fallen fully under Russian control. The Russians continue to push westwards from this area towards the Dnieper. That could be the main focus of the Russian advance. And there are lots and lots of stories, reports, that the Russians have now taken control of all of the villages, of all the islands in the Dnieper River, near Kherson region, that they are conducting raids into Kherson region on the west bank of the Dnieper, the Ukrainian-controlled part of Kherson region, that they are conducting raids into the city of Kherson itself, which the Russians withdrew from in the autumn of 2022. And, well, there are lots of rumours that the Russians might be preparing or planning some big cross-river operation in the spring or summer to retake Kherson from the Ukrainians. This is all very tentative, and I don't know what is true or what is not. The Ukrainians, however, look very overextended and overstretched. It's difficult to know how they will be able to juggle their forces from one part of the front lines to the other. Maybe if there is a cross-river operation in Kherson region, complex and difficult though that operation for the Russians will be, it will be another big blow for the Ukrainians. And then, of course, there is the real possibility, the very real possibility, that when the Russians have driven the Ukrainians out of Kursk region, which they probably will do within the next week or perhaps two, with the capture of Suja, that the Russians will follow the Ukrainians into Sumy region. They already control some places in Sumy region. They might decide to push forward in Sumy region towards the city of Sumy itself. They briefly occupied Sumy in the first days of the special military operation, though they quickly left it. But they might seek to recapture Sumy or capture Sumy. And which if they do, that opens the road to Kiev itself. And, well, one can imagine what the effect of that on Zelensky and on the various people in Kiev might be. So, a gathering crisis for Ukraine. The Russians have resumed missile strikes across Ukraine. The whole situation for Ukraine is looking grimmer than it has ever looked at any point in the war. So, let's move on now and let's veer back to the diplomacy. Now, at the moment, it must be said that there is no visible diplomacy taking place between the Americans and the Russians. The Americans had that meeting with the Russians in Riyadh about 2 weeks ago. I've discussed in 2 programs now why I don't believe that those stories about the Russians telling the Americans that they were prepared to accept a ceasefire in Riyadh over the course of the talks in Riyadh is true. On the contrary, I am quite sure that the Russians said no such thing. And the Russian accounts and the American accounts all say that the details of a settlement of the Ukraine conflict were not really the subject of the discussions in Riyadh at all. The Russians and the Americans, however, have moved forward with appointing ambassadors to each other's countries. There's confirmation that the embassies will have their banking services unblocked. More diplomats will be posted to the respective embassies. So that could set up the situation for more communications between the Russians and the Americans going forward. There is another fact which has perhaps attracted less attention, and that is that after the events in Syria, the terrible events in Syria, I say after them, they are ongoing, just to say. The events in Latakia, the fighting that's taking place there, the reported killings that are taking place there. Anyway, in light of that, there have been statements of concern by both the Russian and American governments, statements which appear critical of the authorities in Damascus. Just saying. And there are reports that the Russians and the Americans at the UN, in the UN Security Council, are now working together on a joint statement to be presented to the Security Council, basically calling for the situation in Latakia province in Syria to be brought under some sort of control, for the fighting to cease, for these killings to stop. At least those are the reports. Now, that would be the second time in the last few weeks that the Americans and the Russians have worked together in the United Nations. They worked together recently when, to the absolute horror of the European states, the Americans proposed a resolution first to the General Assembly and then to the Security Council, commemorating the third anniversary of the start of the special military operation, but deleting from that statement all overt criticism of Russia. And the Russians were clearly involved and clearly had some contacts with the American team at the United Nations whilst that resolution was being prepared. And the Russians, of course, backed the Americans at the Security Council when the American resolution passed. Now, the key point about that is that the Security Council often acts as the place where the great powers meet and talk and discuss things with each other, and where essentially they negotiate and agree things between themselves. This is a very often overlooked aspect of the kind of work the UN Security Council does. It's the place where the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans are all physically present. Their strongest diplomats are there. They can meet. They always meet. They meet all the time. It's not like embassies, which meet only occasionally, where embassy officials have only occasional contacts with foreign ministries. In the UN, they are constantly in discussion with each other. They meet in the corridors, they meet in the various rooms and places, and discussions take place there all the time. Recently, when Glenn Deason and myself did a program in which we interviewed the Russian Deputy Ambassador to the UN Security Council, Dmitry Polyansky, he speculated at that time that Russian and American contacts will really only get fully underway when the new US ambassador to the UN, Mrs. Stefanik, was confirmed by the Senate and took up her post. My understanding is that she's still waiting for confirmation. But anyway, the point is, even without Mrs. Stefanik, it's clear that the American and Russian delegations at the UN Security Council are in touch and are meeting with each other and are having talks to sort out the previous UN Security Council resolution about Ukraine, which the Americans proposed and the Russians backed, and the forthcoming joint resolution or statement about Syria, which apparently the Russians and the Americans are working to try to agree with each other. So there are now contacts at that level, and it could be that some of the diplomacy about the UN conflict, the Ukrainian conflict, is taking place through that channel. But in all other respects, as I said, we have no information of any active diplomacy between the Americans and the Russians for the moment at all. The Russians have said, Peskov has said, that there are no plans for the Americans and the Russians to meet again directly after the meeting, the forthcoming meeting in Riyadh between the Americans and the Ukrainians. So we have no direct contact between the Americans and the Russians, but we are going to have a big meeting starting tomorrow between the Ukrainians and the Americans. And, well, the rumour mill about this meeting is working overtime. The amount of stories and claims that are circulating is just off the scale. And, well, we've had Bild Zeitung in Germany saying that the Americans are basically going to tell the Ukrainians that military assistance to Ukraine is not going to resume unless and until President Zelensky steps down, that the Americans consider him to be an obstacle to peace, and that they want him to be removed from the scene, and that is now a condition for a resumption of military aid and intelligence assistance. That is Bild Zeitung. By the way, I think that is most unlikely. I think it all but inconceivable that Secretary Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Steve Witkoff, the three people who are going to turn up at this meeting in Riyadh on the American side, are going to say anything as blunt as that to the Ukrainians. Are going to say to Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei, we want your boss to go. Please tell him to quit, because unless he does, we're going to terminate military aid. It might be what the Americans would like to see. Almost certainly they do want to see Zelensky go. But I don't think that the Americans are going to say it straight out like that to the Ukrainians tomorrow. That's the first thing I would say. The other thing is, there's been other reports that make not entirely dissimilar claims. There was a report in NBC that Donald Trump is telling his aides that if the Ukrainians come forward and say that they're prepared to sign the mineral rights extraction deal, that's fine and Trump will be happy, but it too will not be enough to restart American military aid and intelligence assistance. What Trump wants to see is definite commitments from the Ukrainians that they are interested in moving forward with peace talks. And according to NBC, that means a definite commitment from the Ukrainians to cede territory to Russia. That this has to be the minimum now that the Ukrainians must give at this meeting in Riyadh for that aid to resume. So that's according to NBC. And there are other reports that say other things entirely. So the Financial Times says that the Ukrainians are coming to the meeting in Riyadh with Macron's proposal for a temporary stop in air and drone attacks, attacks on energy infrastructure, and attacks on shipping in the Black Sea. And the Ukrainians are going to try and sell that to the Americans as an earnest of their good faith in order to get American assistance resume. I have to say, I would be astonished if the Americans were generally impressed by that kind of proposal coming from Macron. To me, as my colleague Alex Christoforou has said, this looks like essentially a demand for a no-fly zone, which the Russians are never going to accept. They've already rejected this proposal outright, and I cannot imagine that the Americans are under any illusions that the Russians would agree, in effect, to what amounts to a no-fly zone established over Ukraine, or at least Western Ukraine, even on a temporary basis. I think this is a fantastic plan, and I always have thought so. So I can't believe that the Americans will be satisfied with something like that. I'm going to here give my own guess. What the Americans will probably want from the Ukrainians is something rather more simple. They will want the Ukrainians to confirm that they are prepared to start negotiations with the Russians. And these must be negotiations without preconditions. In other words, there must be an agreement for a venue for the Ukrainians to send their negotiators and for them to meet the Russian negotiators. Peskov, by the way, has said that for the Russians, the obvious location for negotiations like that is Minsk. The Ukrainians probably will balk at sending their negotiators to Minsk. They might prefer Turkey. I think if Turkey is proposed, the Russians might accept it, but they might suggest Riyadh instead and might say that that is a more appropriate place for talks to take place. Or if not Riyadh, perhaps Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Doha, just saying. Anyway, the Americans will want a definite commitment from the Ukrainians that they're prepared to engage in talks, a definite commitment from the Ukrainians that they are prepared to make substantive concessions to the Russians, and that will include a willingness to discuss the question of territory, and also an acceptance by the Ukrainians, and this is probably going to need to be a categorical acceptance by the Ukrainians that Ukraine will not join NATO and will not seek to enter into an alliance of any kind with the United States. And if the Ukrainians are prepared to do that, if they're prepared to tell the Americans that yes, they are prepared to meet the Russians, and that they're prepared to meet them in Minsk or Riyadh or Dubai or Ankara or Istanbul or Abu Dhabi or wherever, then maybe the Americans will say, well, that's enough. We can now take this to the Russians. We can see where this is going. And in the meantime, we are prepared, at least for the time being, to resume intelligence information, though perhaps not military supplies. I mean, that might be a reasonable expectation of what the Americans will look to from these talks in Riyadh. I want to stress, this is pure guesswork on my part. Secretary Rubio is not on the phone to me explaining to me what the Americans are looking for, nor is Mr. Witkoff. I'm not in touch with any of these people. I've been listening to what President Trump has been saying. Sometimes he talks about imposing more sanctions on the Russians. Other times he talks about the fact that he needs to be convinced that the Ukrainians are really looking for peace. President Trump is the only person who is providing us with information upon which we can draw conclusions. But I think beyond the information that he is providing, there is the underlying drive that President Trump undoubtedly has towards achieving peace and towards trying to do that as quickly as possible. And here I'm going to come back to various things that Professor Mearsheimer, perhaps the single most prescient commentator about the Ukrainian conflict of all, the one who said, I think it was way back in 2014 or 2015 or whenever it was, that Ukraine was being led along the primrose path towards its own destruction. Absolutely true when he said it, as we've now seen. Anyway, I come back to what Professor Mearsheimer has recently been saying. He's been saying it in quite a lot of places, by the way, but he also said it in the latest program that Glenn Deason and I were privileged to do with him, which you will find on the Duran, which is that having committed himself and his administration to a path towards peace, towards ending the conflict in Ukraine, or at least towards ending America's participation in this conflict. It makes no sense at all for President Trump to go back on all of that, to accuse the Russians of being obstructive, and to revert to the Biden policy of continuous escalation. So that would be an admission of complete failure, a failure to understand the Russians, a failure to achieve peace, and it would be politically enormously damaging for Donald Trump to do that and for his entire administration to do it. So yes, Trump is threatening more sanctions against the Russians. He did that, of course, the week after his inauguration in a notorious post he published on Truth Social, but he didn't act on that then. I don't believe in all seriousness that he's going to act on that threat that he's just made. No, I think if he gets the Ukrainians to agree to negotiations, the next step will be to arrange that meeting with the Russians to see whether the Russians are prepared to talk to the Ukrainians. They've said they will. The Russians will push back against any suggestions of a ceasefire, but they will say that certainly they're prepared to talk to the Ukrainians, and they will suggest a venue. Well, they've already suggested Minsk as a potential venue, but they will certainly, I'm sure, be prepared to be flexible on that point. And then my guess is that with negotiations between Ukraine and Russia likely to begin, Trump is going to start relaxing sanctions. Now, this has been very much his purpose. We've seen that he's already taken steps to unblock the embassies. The Russians have wanted that, and it seems it is actually happening. The Russians have also suggested that air links between the United States and Russia should be re-established. And by the way, I've had it confirmed that American and Russian aircraft can indeed fly to each other's countries. Commercial jets can indeed fly to each other's countries, bypassing European airspace. It's well within the range capabilities of modern aircraft. And I'm told, by the way, that the Ilyushin 96, which is not, by the way, in service with the Russian civil aviation, but which probably will soon be again, actually has a longer range than the Boeing 747. Just saying. Anyway, that's what I've been told. I know nothing about these matters, so if anybody wants to come out and contradict this, they're welcome to do so. Anyway, one way or the other, re-establish air links. But apparently, the administration is now also looking to do that very thing that I have suggested all along, would be the most meaningful and productive of all steps towards sanctions relief that the administration could take, which is to start relaxing the sanctions on Russian energy products, the trading on Russian energy products, lifting the price cap and ending the restrictions of that kind. Because that would allow trade in Russian oil and gas to take place without the worries and restrictions which go with it. That would probably lead to an increase in Russian exports and of oil and gas products. There is currently some downward pressure on oil prices. The resumption of Russian oil exports, or at least the lifting on restrictions on Russian exports, would intensify that. That would free up the energy market. Oil prices, therefore, would be likely to fall further. The Russians are approaching matters from a strong current account position. They would probably not be worried about that. It would make America's friends in India very happy, and it would also reduce tensions with China. And there are reports that President Trump wants to meet with the Chinese leadership, with Xi Jinping himself in April, and is even thinking about traveling to China to do that. So it would be a logical step to take. It would annoy the Europeans mightily. Ursula von der Leyen, incredibly, is still speaking about the Europeans wanting to take further steps to restrict the import of Russian natural gas products. It seems incredible that after all that has happened, that option, that possibility is still being talked about, but, well, we see that it is. So one can see how getting the Ukrainians to agree to negotiations, allowing the Americans to move on, relaxing sanctions, perhaps finally having that meeting with Putin later this month, and again I'm going to guess Riyadh is the logical venue for that meeting. How all of this, from an American point of view, from a Trump administration point of view, makes sense. Now, I would say that also lifting restrictions on Russian energy products makes further sense because there are now clear signs that recession risks are growing in the United States and growing elsewhere as well. Now, entirely predictably, all of this is being blamed on Donald Trump and on his tariff policies, which might have made some disruptions in the market, but which are not the underlying reasons why we might be heading for recession. The reason we're likely to be heading towards recession is because the United States has been in effective recession already. It probably was even during the last months of the Biden administration. The underlying deterioration in the economic health of the United States, which in my opinion was taking place throughout the 4 years of the Biden administration, was masked by a policy of running massive deficits. In other words, through constant fiscal emission. That appears to be changing as the Trump administration, Elon Musk and Doge and all of that are taking the first, and they're only the very first steps to try to rein in spending. And that is probably having some effect on the economy. But just to say, eventually, even this huge growth in fiscal emissions, the increase in money supply that the Biden administration has been engaging in, would have eventually reached its ultimate point where it could not mask the underlying problems in the economy any longer. It was because those problems exist that the American people turned to Donald Trump. Just saying. So, there is likely going to be a recession in the United States over the next few months. Apparently, Trump himself is aware of that possibility, and he's warning his aides about this, and he's saying that they should expect that there will be a rocky period over the next few months, especially as the United States readjusts its economy. A wise warning, by the way, that one wonders how much attention people will pay to it. But anyway, given that that is so, taking steps to further reduce oil prices by granting Russia sanctions relief, and perhaps by importing Russian heavy crude after the stop on imports of heavy crude from Venezuela will make sense, because reducing energy costs in the United States is perhaps the one thing that will support the US most effectively, US consumers most effectively, going into a recession. So it all makes sense. It makes sense from the perspective of the Trump administration. Now, beyond this, we will have a period of negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Americans obviously will still be involved on the side. Sooner or later, inevitably, the Ukrainians are going to backtrack. It's going to become visible to the Americans that that is the case. And then all sorts of things might start to happen. Now, I've said that the Americans and the Russians both would love to see Zelensky go. They appear to have competing favorites for who they think would take over from him. The Americans favor Yulia Tymoshenko. The Russians favor Viktor Medvedchuk. Yulia Tymoshenko is now making increasing criticisms of the Ukrainian leadership, of Zelensky himself. But she's started now to make criticisms of the German leadership as well. She's made some strong criticisms, for example, of the German intelligence chief or deputy intelligence chief, in a way that suggests that she's distancing herself from the Europeans and is aligning herself more closely to the Americans as well. She says that she doesn't want elections, and why would she? What she probably wants, she knows that if there were elections, it's unlikely at the moment that she would win them. Just saying. So what she probably wants is Zelensky to pack his bags and go, and for her to move into Bankovo, the building which houses the Ukrainian president's offices, in his place. She would be an interim president. She would then negotiate with the Russians to try to achieve some kind of ceasefire, or at least some kind of cessation of hostilities as soon as possible. And then she'd call elections, and then she would win. And she would win with the promise given to the Americans and perhaps to the Russians that she will be able to move forward and make substantive concessions to the Russians along the lines of Istanbul Plus. That's probably what is in her mind, and it might be what the Americans are urging her to do also. But anyway, we mustn't move too far ahead of ourselves. I don't know how things are going to play out. I'm confident of one thing: whatever concessions the Ukrainians make or appear to make at the talks in Riyadh to the Americans in order to get American military aid and intelligence sharing restarted. They are certain over the next couple of weeks, months, to walk back. The Ukrainians have no sincerity about wanting negotiations with the Russians. At least the current Ukrainian government does not. They want the aid flow from Europe and the United States to continue. They are not interested in a negotiated outcome. I think by now the Americans have understood this, as of course have the Russians. That effectively puts paid to the idea of a ceasefire, and it makes it all but inevitable that the war in some form will continue, even whilst perhaps an appearance of negotiations takes place. Anyway, I've just outlined what I think is a plausible view of how events might play out over the next couple of weeks. But to repeat again, I'm not certain that it will follow anything like the outline I've suggested, because none of the parties are confiding in me, and you should accept that this is speculation, though informed speculation, based on all of the information that I have seen and what American and Ukrainian and Russian officials have said. Now, in the meantime, the situation in the European Union goes from bad to worse. A couple of days ago, we had the, I think, utterly absurd story from Romania that a nefarious group of people there, led by a general with, I suspect, some rather cranky ideas, a general who is retired and long since retired, and who is 101 years old, was supposedly in league with the Russians, preparing some kind of coup to overthrow the Romanian state. Now, if this coup story had any reality to it, well, if you believe that, you want to believe in that story, that there really was a coup, then, as I often say, I have a bridge to sell you. This is, to my mind, an utterly fantastic idea, and it should not be taken seriously. Anyway, we know here that Mr. Georgescu, the man who a plurality of Romanians tell opinion polls they want to be their next leader, the single most popular political figure in Ukraine, has been prohibited from standing for election in Romania during the rerun of the elections in May. Now, we're told that this is because of his extremist opinions. These extremist opinions were not a reason for preventing him from standing previously in the elections which were annulled last year, but suddenly they've become a problem, and they're leading to Mr. Georgescu being prevented from standing. It is an astonishing retreat from democratic norms. That's all I can say. I could say an awful lot. That's all I'm going to say. I could say an awful lot. And of course, there are rumours. I think they're more than rumours, actually. They're almost certainly true. There are reports, let's say, they're not confirmed reports, that the Romanian authorities are taking these steps following instructions, or at least requests, let's call them requests, from the European authorities, the European Commission in Brussels. If so, this makes what is already a very sinister development worse still, because not only are the Romanian authorities acting in a way that I, for one, cannot recognise as democratic in any respect. To me, this is a negation of democracy, not its performance or execution or whatever. Not only is this a negation of democracy, but it is a negation of democracy carried out at the bidding of a third party, an outside power, one located in Brussels. Well, that already tells us how bad the situation in the European Union has now become. But of course, we now have all of this long plan, these huge plans for military build-ups and all of that kind of thing that we've been hearing so much about over the last few days. Well, there's an article about it in the Daily Telegraph. It's interesting that these articles are coming out in the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph is perhaps the most fervently supportive of Ukraine of all the newspapers in Britain, just saying. But anyway, there's a good article about this in the Daily Telegraph by Matthew Lynn, saying how all this is pie in the sky. It says European rearmament is a losing bet, and market reaction to the promise of defence spending is starting to look like a frenzied bubble. And he goes on to say that though there's been a massive surge, share buying in European defence companies, it's a complete misconception to think that this is actually going to lead to any big increase in defence spending. He says, first, Europe doesn't actually have any money. In Britain, an increase in defence spending has so far been funded by raiding the overseas budget, but that will only go so far. In France, there is vague talk from ministers of raising taxes on the wealthy, but with the state already collecting close on 50% of GDP, and with a deficit still projected to run at more than 5% of GDP this year, it is far from clear the government can actually lay its hand on any actual cash. Friedrich Merz, Germany's incoming chancellor, has at least pledged to suspend the country's constitutional debt brake, and so should be able to borrow money. But he still has to get that through Parliament before a single euro can be spent. And by the way, the Greens, predictably, are already kicking a fuss about this, though they will probably come round before very long, just saying. But anyway, he then goes on to say, meanwhile, the EU talks a lot about joint funding and may be able to issue some more bonds, but it still hasn't managed to agree on any mechanism for paying back all the debt it has now taken on. The important point is this: it is all funny money, conjured out of thin air with accounting tricks and off-balance sheet shenanigans. No one is talking about raising extra taxes to pay for all the defence equipment. But there are limits to how much you can borrow, and it may only be a matter of time before the bond markets choke on all the extra paper they are meant to absorb. Next, there is a limit to how much money governments can cajole investment, how much government can cajole investment into the sector. In the UK, the government is leaning on the city to relax its environmental, social and governance rules to pour money into the defence industry. The same is happening in Paris, Frankfurt and Milan, but that will only give the defence companies a one-off boom. And anyway, the long and the short of it is that he doubts that this defence spending surge can be sustained. And I completely agree with him. He doesn't, of course, look into the far more fundamental capacity constraints, the lack of industrial plant, the lack of skilled workers, the lack of pretty much everything else that goes to make up a military-industrial complex that is such a problem in Europe and which will not be solved for decades. So anyway, we see big talk from the Europeans going along with terrible things happening across the European Union. We see complex diplomatic moves, mostly focused on the Americans. But the real story continues to be on the battlefronts. And there we see a deepening, massive crisis for Ukraine, with a collapse in Kursk that it seems cannot be reversed. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.